the 17-year-old girl ceased running into the forest from the hellish family she had escaped the shackles of, to rest for a short time. As she started to regain her breath, her phone rang. The young lady pulled her cell phone out of her left pocket and put on a disgusted expression when she looked and saw that it was indeed her mother. The scorned teenager pressed the red button and turned off her phone, determined to never talk to any of those despicable people again. With that out of the way, the girl began to walk deeper into the now darkening forest. The daylight was beginning to fade, and she felt the urge to become frantic, thinking of how she would construct a means for shelter and warmth. The timid child had been wandering in the dark of the woods for nearly 3 hours, resisting the urge to scream in terror at all the little creaks of a branch in the low wind, or the eerie hoot of an owl glaring at her as she passed by. Her hope began to wane, and she was ready to break down and cry, until she looked straight ahead and spotted several lights, glowing faintly in the distance, just beyond an entanglement of trees and bushes. This, now hopeful young woman, grinned when she also heard voices, some of it sounding like singing, originating from the same direction. The girl started to walk slowly toward the lights and voices, remaining still and quiet behind the bushes. The girl gazed upon the sight with amazement. The lights and voices were, in fact, people, an entire village filled with the singing of joyous women and children, the merry laughter of men drinking at what looked to be a tavern, and the aroma of freshly prepared meat in the air. The oddest detail about this village was the architecture and the apparel of the townsfolk. None of it appeared to belong in the year 2018, more like 18th century clothing and architecture. Dumbfounded, the curious girl wondered, these people looked so joyful. Would they take me if I asked to join their community? She then realized that her clothing and phone may cause her to draw unwanted attention in this gleeful society. She became distraught, unsure of what she would do to resolve this dilemma. She loathed the idea of returning to that prison of a home. The scar on her right cheek, made by her father's bowie knife, reminded her of that. The forest did not seem any more welcoming, especially at night. Conflicted and bitter, the troubled youth elected to simply sit behind the bushes, soaking in the pleasant sounds of singing and the laughter of children, until her vision grew black and sleep took her hostage. The girl's eyes slowly opened to the sun overhead and a golden retriever licking her face. She giggled slightly and sat up as she began to pet the dog, but stopped abruptly when she saw a boy standing over her, giving her a perplexing stare. Thanks for finding my dog. Who are you, and why are you wearing those strange clothes?" She replied, blushing. "My name is Lisa, and I ran away from home, from my family." The boy raised an eyebrow and inquired, "Why?" "Because my parents and little brother would beat me daily, and—" Lisa trailed off and turned her gaze toward the ground. "I'd rather not say anything more about it." The boy frowned and quickly apologized for prying into her affairs, before offering his hand to help her up off the ground. Lisa smiled and took his hand, pulling herself to her feet, stretching her arms, letting the grogginess fall from her body. She took a moment to gather herself and found her eyes meeting his. The boy's eyes are a shade of green to blue, and his demeanor seemed pleasant. His hair is dark brown, shoulder length. She figured him to be close to her age. The boy beamed a smile at her, and holding out his hand, he introduced himself. "My name is Ethan Thatcher." "Good to meet you, Ethan," shaking his hand as she blushed a hard red and smiled back. "Would you like to come back to my house? My mother has some clothes that might fit you. You will draw a lot of attention with those clothes, and you are the first outsider to arrive in our village." Lisa thought gingerly about taking Ethan's offer. She did not want to go back to those trolls for parents, and she did long to have a safe and happy home again. To know she would be able to live her life as she saw fit, without cruelty and ridicule. Alas, if she did accept his offer, Lisa may never see the outside world again. With that realization, she perked up and gleefully accepted his proposal. "Certainly, I would love to come back with you. And you're right about my attire. The last thing I want is to cause an upset in your little village." Ethan, still smiling, nodded and said, with a touch of enthusiasm, "Splendid! Our house is on the other side of the village, just on the edge past the orange tree." The odd fellow beckoned Lisa to follow him, and so she did, while thinking, "The orange tree? Why do they have only one tree that grows oranges?" Ethan called his dog over to him, and the two of them began walking around the village. Entering the village, the two of them thought it best to walk around it, behind various houses, taverns, bakeries, and there were even a few brothels as well. The mysterious village formed a perfect circle around the orange tree, which Lisa caught a glimpse of as Ethan led her to his house. The tree is enormous, close to the size of the White House, height-wise, that is. Its leaves are greener than the grass that surrounds the village, appearing to be a brighter shade of green than she had ever laid her eyes on. It was as if the plant life in and around this village appeared to be more alive and healthier than what one would see in their own backyard. She took note of one perplexing detail. She saw no one picking any oranges from it. Not one person had even looked at the wooden giant other than herself. "Okay, we're clear to keep moving. Our house is just ahead of here. I can see it," Ethan whispered, breaking the trance that had overtaken Lisa. "All right, let's get moving then." Ethan grinned, and they continued onward to their destination. Ethan brought Lisa to the back of his house, most likely to sneak her inside before putting his parents in a state of shock, while the strange young lady still wore her modern-day clothing. "Remain quiet and stay close to me." Ethan approached the door, taking great care not to cause the steps to creak. Then, slowly turning the doorknob, he opened it cautiously. Lisa waited at the bottom of the steps as Ethan scanned just inside the doorway and down the hall. Lisa still had that tree lingering within her mind. Ethan turned to look at her, pressed a finger to his lips, and motioned for her to follow him inside. The two crept as quietly as possible, turning right down the hallway until they came to an empty room. "This is my room. Wait here until I find you some clothes." Lisa nodded in agreement and walked into his room. Taking a seat on his bed, Ethan shut the door behind him, and then, when she heard his footsteps fade, Lisa heard nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat. The interior of the house also had the likeness of something out of the 18th century colonial America period. This village and its people were an oddity in the full definition of the word. Lisa was studying Ethan's room closely, taking note of the plain wooden walls lacking paint, the simple bed she sat on, and glancing at the single bookshelf sitting next to the head of his bed, a window to the right, when she heard footsteps growing closer to the door. She grew tense, hoping the footsteps belonged to Ethan, not his parents. It had felt like an hour since Ethan left her alone in his room, so she was curious as to why he took such a long time, and what kind of clothing he would bring her. Moments passed since hearing the footsteps, and the door opened, revealing Ethan holding a blue dress over his right arm, his dog sitting to the left of him, panting and staring at Lisa. "This dress belonged to my mother when she was your age. It should fit comfortably on you." Ethan blushed hard while he handed her the dress, Smiling, Lisa replied, "Thank you. It's beautiful." She took the dress from Ethan and examined it, admiring the white buttons along the chest area and the white lace collar at the top. The dress is a heavy shade of blue, simple yet elegant in texture and design. It was crafted from silk and bore several strange symbols across the surface of the dress. Ethan still stood in the doorway when Lisa looked up at him and said, "If you would please give me some privacy." "Oh, of course. I beg your pardon." Ethan blushed as he closed the door behind him. Lisa let out a soft giggle and shook her head before commencing with putting on the dress. 10 minutes later, Lisa opened the door, finding Ethan and his dog waiting outside for her. "It feels amazing. I love it," she said, whispering as to not disturb Ethan's parents. Ethan was in awe at how beautiful she looked, and so he blushed a beet red when he uttered, "You look amazing." Lisa blushed and smiled at him, before Ethan gathered himself and said, "Well, time to meet my mother and father. Let me do the talking. I can handle my parents. They are actually kind people once they warm up to you." Lisa nodded, and then at that they headed towards the kitchen, where his mother and father were waiting for him, to sit and break fast with them. Crossing the threshold of the kitchen, Ethan motioned for Lisa to come next to him as he said, "Mother, Father, this is Lisa." Ethan's father set the book down he had been reading on the table, and his mother turned to face him just as she was about to set the table. Both stared at the foreign girl, eyes widening and jaws agape. It had been a week since she had stumbled upon this village and met Ethan and his parents. His parents had grown fond and sympathetic of Lisa after Ethan explained to them that she was seeking asylum from her barbaric family. He needed not to say any more, and so they began treating her as their own. Even the villagers took a liking to her, as she started to gradually grow accustomed to their way of life. Still, that strange tree kept entering her mind. She longed to take an orange from it and taste of it. The fruit looked delicious, and she yearned to find out what would happen if she did. So, she decided to finally ask Ethan about the alien tree, and he only shrugged and responded with, "I'm not sure why it's considered so sacred. I only know what my parents and the elders of the community told me, since I was a child, that picking or eating any of the oranges from that tree is forbidden. It has not changed in the slightest through the years, and no birds perch in its branches, and squirrels refuse to make a home there." His answer only strengthened her curiosity. Lisa's face became puzzled as he turned his back to her. Entering his house, she lingered on the lawn, turning to face the orange tree. Lisa began to walk towards the mysterious plant mammoth. Transfixed on the oranges, she resolved to take just one orange. One orange won't hurt anything, and there are so many, no one will even notice it's missing. She stood adjacent to the tree, directly under a plump and rather large fruit. It was this one she chose, and then reached for the seductive food, pulling it gently from its branch. Lisa looked around, nervously, to make sure she was not being watched. Darkness had fallen, and everyone was either asleep or staying inside for the night. She then brought her eyes back to the orange, its bright color calling her to take a bite, and let the juice gush into her mouth. She peeled off the skin and then bit into it. The taste was divine. She allowed the chunk of fruit to sit in her mouth before swallowing, savoring the sweetness of its essence. Seconds later, the tree and the ground around it began to turn black and withered. All the other oranges fell from the tree, black and rotted, and the orange she was holding started to bleed red. It was blood, emerging from the cursed food, and Lisa's eyes widened in horror as she let the defiled thing fall to the ground. Screams erupted from all around her. The people sounded like they were in pain. and the buildings crumbled before her. She realized too late that this tree was the life source for the village, that somehow it kept it and the people alive and tethered here in the year 2018, unchanged by time. She backed as far away from the tree as she could, watching in terror as it continued to wither into a dried up stump. She fell to her knees, feeling helpless, listening to the screams of the villagers, dying a slow death because of her. She had been responsible for destroying the one good thing to come into her life, and the only boy she had come to love. Once the screams died out, Lisa stood up, tears streaming down her face, and walked toward the stump of what used to be a beautiful tree, full of wonder, and sat upon it, crying. The rain poured hard, hiding her tears, as she now sits alone, surrounded by ruined buildings of what had been a joyous village.